All right, I'm here today with Trey from the YouTube channel TelosBound. I recently became aware of this channel. I think actually a commentator, or commenter rather, recommended that I talk to Trey at some point, and finally I'm getting around to doing that. So as I understand it, Trey is Orthodox Christian, or a recent convert, and is interested in philosophy. I've seen him mention Hegel. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to check out a lot of his stuff. So Trey, why don't you just kind of introduce yourself? How did you get interested in making YouTube videos, and where did your interest in philosophy and Orthodox Christianity start?
Sure. Well, I'm glad to be here. I've been a big fan for a few years at least. Well, firstly, I just want to say that I want to apologize to Jordan, who is the commentator you mentioned, because I told him that I think he said that he wasn't responsible for getting this interview together, or I told him that I think it's probably Gabe who's responsible for it. But now that you mentioned Jordan, seems like it was him who sort of introduced you to me. So I apologize to Jordan. Well, okay, so I started TelosBound in September 2021. I made my first video on Žižek, and sort of Žižek has been a common theme throughout my whole channel. And I have to say most of the growth of my channel has been due to my Žižek related content. And I've had like people like, I don't know if you're familiar with Todd McGowan, but he's basically a Žižek, not student, but like he's probably the most famous Žižekian behind Žižek. So I've had him on my channel multiple times. I set up we set up a debate between him and Graham Harman, the object-oriented ontology guy. So yeah, the Žižek content has been pretty much the central part of my channel so far. And I did kind of go into making videos with that in mind, because the Žižek community is really big, and I think it's because he is still alive and he's a really charismatic guy. And I do think he has really valuable work, not just his political stuff. Actually, I think his political stuff is the weakest. I think his stuff on, like his reading of Hegel, his understanding of ontology, of philosophy of subjectivity, all of this stuff is what interests me the most about Žižek. And what I like about the Žižek community is typically they're not just like looking for basic introductions. Like with like, for example, like my experience with the online Nietzsche community, they're not typically interested in like deep ontology, philosophy, like rigorous philosophy.
Neither was Nietzsche.
Yeah, neither was Nietzsche, exactly. Yeah. So like that's like, so I kind of strategically chose the Žižek community because I really like Žižek, and I kind of wanted to get a decent amount of followers who are into serious philosophy, because that's sort of the stuff I do, like the video essays. Like it's not like I'm not just trying to make like 5-minute introduction videos to stuff. And I'm not saying those don't have their own value. I mean, that's how I got into philosophy originally, but yeah, so but my history with philosophy definitely goes further back, and it's a really long story, so I'll just basically give a brief rundown. I began, like most people, with on the political side of stuff. Specifically, I was a libertarian. Actually, if you go even further back than that, I started out as like a militant atheist type, which led me into politics. I became a libertarian. I probably would have called myself like an ANCAP, and then I sort of found the whole, I don't even know what you call it anymore. At the time, it was like the neo-reactionary community online. So like people like Keith Woods, Joel, Trudell Tom, you in some ways. Kurt Doolittle was around back then. And so all those guys I got interested in. And that basically, I think it's when Trudell Tom sort of left, I sort of stopped being interested in that. And I think it was around that time that I found Žižek, and I found him extremely interesting, and he was one of easily the most interesting philosopher to me. And it mostly had to do with his understanding of subjectivity. So ever since, I would say, 2 years ago when Trudell Tom left, I got really interested in the philosophy of subjectivity, and I decided for some reason at that time to just start writing a book on it. So I was very little knowledge of the tradition of philosophy or much at all, but I wrote the book. And then that was a really big project for me, and it really helped me develop in my own thinking. And it was actually through writing that book, dealing with certain paradoxes related to the subject and subjectivity, that I actually came to orthodoxy. And briefly put, I think that the way the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Church understands spirituality, the Orthodox understanding of man and anthropology really jives well with modern notions of the subject, specifically Zizek and Lacan, but not in the sense of, oh, they're the same, but actually Zizek and Lacan to me are actually providing a sort of framework for fallen subjectivity, what it means to fall out of communion with God. So that's a really big topic, which if, well, I have a bunch of videos on my channel about that, and there have been negative reactions to that from the Zizek community, certain positive reactions from Orthodox people, and so I'm really trying to, my goal right now is to build up an audience who are, I'm leaning more into theology now, so my videos are going to be more on the theology side, Orthodox theology and stuff, but specifically putting philosophy into dialogue with Orthodoxy. So my big project right now, and I guess sort of the goal for 2023 is to bring modern philosophy into dialogue with Orthodox theology in a way that I think is really, like, I think it's very fruitful. I think there's a lot to be there, a lot to be done there. I just don't think many people have done it yet, at least not on YouTube.
Okay, yeah, that's a very different perspective as far as Zizek, Lacan, a modern view on subjectivity and fallen nature than where I'm coming from, which is, I got into Christianity through Advaita Vedanta and kind of perennialist metaphysics, and I practice Catholic. I would be considered a heretic. So I'm curious, do you conform to all of kind of the dogmas of Orthodoxy? And was that a difficult process for you, like including historical facts that must be accepted and all of that?
Right. I would say yes. Yes, I do. Like I understand your position, but I can't say I relate to your position, because to me it's sort of like I'm going into a tradition or I'm not. Like the way you sort of again, and I don't want to be like attacking your position here, but like the way
No,
you
feel
seem
free.
to
Go ahead.
describe it, well, just the way you seem to describe it is like I see truthful thing here, but there is a corruption in church here, and like church fathers, like I know you're talking with Gabe, you're like, oh, the church fathers, they didn't seem to truly have humility or whatever, and it's like it's not that specific point, but it's like just like from the way I see it, you're sort of picking and choosing essentially what you think is true and what conforms with your perennialist or Platonist philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's more of an all-in thing. It's like I want like a one coherent worldview which will be true. And the thing is, like orthodoxy, I don't think there was a challenge, and really it wasn't, because I found that the Orthodox understanding of just the world does conform with my intuition of what is true. And I found that even when something doesn't seem right, when I look into it more, it it kind of does. And one person who really helped me with this is a YouTuber named Seraphim Hamilton, who, in my opinion, is probably the best theologian on YouTube. He's incredible. And he just makes really good videos. And something he really emphasizes is developing a biblical worldview, which is not just arbitrary. And I think that's sort of a problem with modern Christianity and typically Protestant forms of Christianity. It just seems relatively arbitrary. But I think something Orthodox people tend to emphasize, especially guys like Seraphim Hamilton, Jonathan Pajot, is really the fullness of a worldview and making it coherent and symbolically meaningful and all this stuff. So yeah, I basically found that when I stick to Orthodox dogma, I actually come to the truth quicker than I would if I tried to go my own route. And that doesn't mean that I'm not um, trying to, or that I don't engage in sort of novel forms of thinking and bringing orthodoxy into dialogue with stuff that wouldn't otherwise be there, and even in that way, shedding light on on aspects of the tradition which may have just been hadn't really been fully revealed yet. I mean, that's how we understand the development of dogma. I know something. The idea of development of dogma is a really online. It's like a something people don't like to talk about in the Orthodox sphere, but it does exist. I mean, maybe it's not the same as the Roman Catholic understanding, but we do have a development of dogma in the sense that our understanding, like the way we would cash it out, is the Holy Spirit is working in the church to bring us to a fuller understanding of reality. So that's what the development of dogma is. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer to say that, yeah, I do stick to the tradition, and really just because I found it to be more fruitful than when I tried to deviate from it.
Okay. That, I mean, there is a certain risk in doing that, of course. The confirmation that you found the right all-encompassing worldview is that it conforms with intuitions, so it's very subjective so far, you know, from what I'm hearing. Now, I mean, it could be the case that some other worldview that you have not yet explored, you know, like Platonism or like, I don't know, Advaita Vedanta, something like that, would end up satisfying more of those intuitions, or would offer some other epistemological criterion, you know, to ultimately kind of appeal to. So, you know, I do see that risk. I don't see necessarily a justification for like, I have to commit entirely to this tradition, at least not from a philosophical perspective. I can see like pragmatic arguments, sociological arguments, why people have to, you know, conform to the teachings of a particular faith. But I mean, I think philosophy does supersede particular religious systems. Philosophy is kind of an inevitable perennial thing. You can imagine any alternative universe, right, with rational agents, and you can imagine an infinite variety of particular creeds, but in every one of those universes, philosophy has to be present, right? Philosophy can't be stripped away from the human condition, but any particular religion can. So I think that philosophy has to be given a kind of primacy ultimately, and I think that the way that Orthodox theology developed does point to that, in that, you know, the teachings of the Neoplatonic schools ended up kind of falling into the resources of the Orthodox Church at a certain point in history. And it seems like there was a lot of kind of wholesale taking of intellectual work from philosophy. And of course, that's obviously true for Plato himself. I don't want this to be extremely debatey, but you know, I would like to hear your perspective on that. What about the potential dangers of going wholesale into a particular worldview? What if it's wrong? It could be wrong, right? And then why all or nothing in the first place? Why not kind of a slow, you know, contemplative weighing of individual points, and with a mind to building one coherent worldview and like prioritizing the significance of that, but not necessarily like taking everything all at once? Why those two questions, like what if it's wrong, and why does it have to be all or nothing? Philosophically.
Okay, I guess to start with the second one, I don't know if this is philosophical or more of a psychological thing, but I do think there is sort of a rational justification for why it has to be all or nothing. And I think that really it has to do with what Christianity claims about itself. So again, that's not really a philosophical, because it's not external to the worldview of Christianity itself, but I mean, Christianity claims to account for all of reality. The church claims that the Bible is infallible and that it can pronounce infallible teachings. It can establish dogmas that are eternal truths about the nature of the world and of God. To me, I do have philosophical justifications for why I'm in Orthodoxy, like stuff like I think the essence energy distinction, the understanding of what modern Orthodox theologians call the communion ontology. This understanding of the world as this communion between God and man with creation, all of this stuff, I think, is very fruitful and philosophically the most defensible metaphysics. So there are philosophical arguments for why. So everything sort of points me to orthodoxy, along with spiritual experiences that I have had, whether that be odd coincidences or just, I guess, just like a spiritual intuition that I'm on the right path. All of this points me towards orthodoxy, and then I see what orthodoxy says about being the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church, and with that being the case, I just don't think I can go from, oh, everything is pointing me to orthodoxy, and then saying, well, how about I just take a little bit of orthodoxy, and then I pick a little bit from Platonism and all this stuff. Like I'm willing to look into, like, I really do need to look, like, I've read, but not nearly as in depth as I should have. But like, even when and I don't want this to be a debate or anything. I'm not really prepared for that, but or really desire to do that. But in like with your debate with Jay, I think you brought up legitimate points about, especially like one of the main points you kept emphasizing was the fact that the subject seems to be this simple entity that you can never like step behind, and so it has to be one and all. Like, I think that's a good argument that Jay just didn't respond to. But I do think there is a way to cash that out in Orthodox theology. So I haven't really found a philosophical argument that would make me reconsider Orthodox theology. My spiritual experience and everything points me to orthodoxy, and then orthodoxy claims that we're the one true church. Don't deviate from our dogmas. Sure, you can look into these other systems, but be careful in doing so. Don't neglect your prayer life. Don't make sure you have a solid understanding of Orthodox theology so you don't get confused. Maybe have some sort of guide helping you out who's familiar with the tradition. So yeah. And what if I'm wrong? Yeah, I mean, I guess I sort of just have to see, you know. I think Christianity is sort of beautiful because it accounts for that, like, really, when we, like when St. Paul talks about faith, hope, and love, like, what the purpose is ultimately achieving an intimate knowledge of God. And love is the highest form of knowledge, at least in the Orthodox understanding, because it is mutual indwelling. So the Father fully knows the Son in the Spirit because he's fully interior to the Son. So love, that's a relation of love. So love is the fullness of knowledge. So basically, I cannot claim to have absolute certainty that there is God, whether in my own, whether subjectively in my own experience. I'm fairly certain of it. I have experiences that I can't explain and just very strong intuition. And I think there are good objective arguments for it as well. But I think that part of what Orthodoxy says is, like, to achieve that objectivity, it's not a given, and it's not something that you deserve just off the bat. It's something that you have to grow into, because knowing God consists of a particular relation with him, and a relation that can only be achieved through a certain spiritual disposition that involves purification, and then et cetera, et cetera. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, still, I can relate to the kind of, this is the best coherent worldview that you have encountered, that you're dealing with. And so, like, given what you know, it makes sense to stick to that. It still seems like the evidence that you're pointing to, or like the epistemological confirmation of your views, is largely based on your own intuitions. And I think it'd be interesting to see if a more scientific method could be applied to confirm the individual tenets of orthodoxy, as in, like, a community of people having methods of intersubjective consensus, not already appealing to the teaching authority of this or that entity within the church. So I mean, I'm interested, obviously, in your views then regarding mainstream scientific claims, because, you know, as I see it, it's kind of the traditional orthodox position of young earth creationism and anti-evolution and geocentrism, possibly even flat earth, versus all of this scientific, you know, evidence that seems to say the contrary. So what do you make of all of that? I mean, are you a flat earther, or like, where do you draw the line? How much science can we accept and be orthodox?
Not a flat earther. Well, basically, I think you can be orthodox and really accept all of modern, well, not all of them, but like you can accept evolution. I don't want to say it's outright heresy. I mean, I don't know. I know there's very arbitrary ways to try to explain like the fall of man with evolution. Like I don't think you can provide a coherent account of it. So I don't personally believe in evolution. I believe that I am a young earther, and I am not a flat earther, but I'm quite open to the possibility of geocentrism being true. But I really prefer not to talk too much about it, like at least not on my own channel, because one, I honestly have no familiarity with the science. Very little at all. The one argument is that it does seem to be what the Bible teaches. It is undeniably the universal teaching of the church fathers. Like, people have tried to argue against that. I mean, there's like even Augustine, who is the guy people point to. Oh, he interpreted it symbolically of the days. Well, he still was a young earther. So there's that.
Only Origin, really, right?
Only Origin, yeah. And he's like I think Origin was a great and probably a holy man, but not infallible in that respect. And so my friend Sarah from Hamilton that I mentioned, this Orthodox YouTuber, he's really, really into the science, and he's very careful about and cautious when it comes to creation science, because there's so much just junk that has been put out as creation science, and he's very careful about that. He recognizes that it is a relatively new discipline. It's underfunded as well. So, like, for him, his big thing is a creationist should not just be trying to break down certain aspects of the modern scientific paradigm. They should be trying to build their own models. And according to him, and I'm taking it on faith, there have been successful creation models, for example, and actual predictions have been made that were actually the later evidence actually confirmed the predictions of the model. One actual argument, I don't know if I guess you're with this because you're perennialism, but I do think there is a sort of perennialism that you can find throughout the world, and to me, that is better explained by a literal biblical worldview, where at some point in time, probably around 5,000 years ago, all of humanity was reduced to 8 people. So all of the nations of the world stem from a common, like one single man 5,000 years ago, and a common tradition, oral tradition, was passed down. Like, there's stuff like I've read through a large chunk of Native American creation stories, and there are just weird coincidences, like obviously the flood, but also there's one story about there's a guy who is the one person saved in the flood, floating on his canoe, and then he sends a beaver out of his boat to pick up land. In the same way, in the biblical story, obviously Noah's in the ark, he sends out a dove to go pick up land. So it's like these weird coincidences.
Well, one problem there, I will point out, with Native American tales in particular, is there's going to be a lot of interpolation of colonial views in Native American stories. There were oral traditions, and obviously, I mean, there were intermarriages and things like that. So you would expect certain themes to be transmitted in that way. In general, my perspective on why there is this uniform tradition is similar to yours. I do think that most of the myths of our species emanated from relatively kind of concentrated original communities. I kind of follow Joseph Campbell in saying there are 2 main mythological strains in the world. One is the equatorial belt that happens first probably in North Africa, which involves a number of themes that he treats, looking at stories from Melanesia, India, Middle Eastern nations, North African traditions. And these involve things like the forbidden fruit, the kind of tying of the beginning of sexual reproduction with the consumption of this forbidden fruit, a sacrifice of like the first, or rather like the most beautiful man and young woman. There's some like human sacrifice element, forbidden fruit element, and a few other. There's also the idea in this tradition of like an afterworld journey where you have to memorize some kind of path. And so various like Melanesian tribes will spend a lot of time like drawing these intricate patterns that are supposed to be like the path that you'll have to follow in the afterlife. So there are very like systematic conformities between different mythological systems in this domain. Campbell hypothesizes basically a spread as of 20,000 BC through to 2000 BC with the recent Melanesian and Polynesian migrations of that mythological strain. The other is the Siberian tradition, and he looks at the Paleolithic cultures of Europe as well as Central Asia, Siberia, and that involves basically imagery around the hunt, shamanism, and the belief that basically the spirit of animals offers itself to the hunter when the hunter is like, kind of in tune with nature and has the right kind of humble, accepting attitude towards the generosity of natural spirits. So, and those are, two systems that emanate from relatively close-knit groups. I think in the history of the species, certain groups have been more advanced than others, and in general, when an advanced group crops up, it spreads its influence over a vast horizon, like the Indo-European expansion. I'm really into anthropology and all this stuff, so for me, where I've spent a lot of time over many years looking at these different hypothesized cultures and like what happened 10,000 years ago at the beginning of the Neolithic, I'm looking at the arguments that archaeologists make, that linguists make, as far as why we should believe there are these certain language families like Afroasiatic, Indo-European, and then how we explain the exceptions. And the picture that they paint, I'm pretty happy with. Also that it does account for why you would see these similarities in various myths. The flood myth in particular, there are major historical floods that have happened. One you would expect to have been transmitted with Indo-European speaking peoples because the Black Sea flooded its banks. It used to be that the Bosphorus Strait didn't exist, right? It was the Black Sea was a freshwater lake. This is what they say. 5,500 years ago, that kind of the Bosphorus Strait opened up, and the Black Sea expanded very greatly. So a lot of land in that kind of heartland of Indo-European speaking peoples. If the Gimbutas like standard hypothesis as to the homeland of Indo-European speaking peoples is correct, basically their homeland was flooded 5,500 BC. So those memories would have been very powerful, and they would have carried those stories. There are also major flooding events, obviously, in Mesopotamia. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking at it with an interest in all of these individual fields about prehistory. I have a 4-part series. It's about 2 hours total on prehistory, going through a lot of the bones that we have for various periods and how we can trace human evolution, looking at like reconstructing it. So this is something that I'm interested in, and I know that there's no way we can resolve all the technical points in which theory explains the data better. But from my perspective, I'm very happy.
Technical points.
Right. So, this is generally, what I found when people believe that the framework that they're buying into explains all the evidence. It amounts to a kind of preemptive judgment or a prejudice that your explanation is right when you actually haven't like tested it on all individual cases and seen if it has superior explanatory power. I kind of approach science and philosophy existentially in a way, and pragmatically, where we are confronted with like problems in various ways, like pragmatic problems, also explanatory problems, like how did this happen? Why do we find X artifact in X location? And then, you know, the process of science is kind of generating hypotheses to account for these, and the hypotheses should accord with a broader network of theories. And I think like the Dewey-Quine thesis is true in saying that like no bare fact stands alone, no hypothesis stands alone. To have intelligibility, a hypothesis has to be tied into a bigger framework, and what constitutes data and how is explained within the context of a holistic framework. So I'm with you that you need a holistic framework, but I feel like some frameworks hold up really well to scrutiny on a number of points, and others don't. And generally, I don't find creationists, you know, accounting for all the evidence that I've looked at that I'm interested in with regard to prehistory. So that's like one of the main barriers for me to just go full, you know, young Earth type stuff.
Well, I understand. I completely understand. And like I also understand where you're coming from. And I should just say right away, like I already said this, but I literally, when I say I don't have familiarity with the science, I mean like I don't have any familiarity with the science, like in any degree, because for one, it doesn't really interests me. I mean, I should look into it at some point, right? But for like, I have been like, I graduated high school 6 months ago, so like I haven't had time to really do the type of stuff like really get into. So like basically, I'm just trying to familiarize myself with philosophy, and I started in a weird way where like the first person I really took a deep dive into was Žižek. So like it ideally, I guess you would probably say it should have been Plato, but like I'm also, you know, getting deeper into Heidegger. So well actually the big guy actually Nietzsche. So I've had Nietzsche, Žižek, and now going into Heidegger. Going to get into Plato, trying to get into Orthodox theology at the same time. So I'm doing all this stuff, and I'm trying to like match that with my videos that I'm making, so I can like it's not like I'm reading stuff and then have to read more for my videos. It's like I'm making it all work together. And I'm doing this like with my writing project as well. But like basically what I'm saying is like I just haven't had enough time really to develop a full worldview. And I think part of the reason why orthodoxy is appealing. Like I'm trying to look at this objectively. Like I'm not saying like I have doubts about orthodoxy, because I really don't. But like just looking at it objectively, I can see why orthodoxy provided was appealing to me, because of the way it because of the holistic framework it sort of provided, and the fact that when I don't have an answer to it, I can say, well, it's kind of just faith. You know, I kind of just accept the framework, and I'm willing to see. But like with me, it's not like faith and I don't care. It's like if there's a problem that's really bothering me, and even if it's not bothering me, like eventually I'm going to get to it and I'm going to try to work through it. And who knows? Like I don't think you're supposed to say this, but it's possible that, like as Orthodox, you're not supposed to say, well, maybe one day it'll be proven wrong. But like, I mean, at least from my perspective, maybe once we're all in heaven, it's going to be a ridiculous thing to say, obviously, and I can look back at this as an error. But like from my perspective, right now, it is entirely possible that orthodoxy is wrong, and there's no way I can know that. So like it's more actually prideful for me to say that, oh, there's no way orthodoxy is wrong. That's assuming I have the objective knowledge, which I don't. So for me, it's not like I don't think we're in too much disagreement as it may seem at face value to someone watching, for example, because like I am, for me, it's like I have my worldview and I'm going to retroactively try to justify it in the most objective way possible. And the way it's been occurring so far has worked out for me. And one of the big problems is and I have found it to be true through personal experience, sort of the way in which trying to go about it alone actually has even more dangers than the dangers you were talking about with accepting the worldview on faith and then sort of justifying it retroactively. Because I do think there's many more, if orthodoxy is true, there are many more dangers to going about it alone. And we just have to keep in mind here that my presupposition here is that orthodoxy is true. So I don't just want to go about it alone and then, you know, who knows, in 20 years I'm like in some cave somewhere doing mushrooms. So I don't want to like, I want to sort of go about it the way my tradition says to go about it. And I sort of trust from my experience in the past that it'll all work out. So yeah.
Yeah, the only real objection, I mean, at a personal level, as far as being concerned about the fate of your soul and what you should do, I don't have a major problem with what you're talking about. What I do have a problem with is when that impinges on the sphere of philosophy, because what orthodoxy can amount to is a lot of claims of knowledge that people don't have. And I don't like that in the public discourse, when people making strong claims about certain things, when you should know whether you know something or you have an opinion. And you're indicating like an awareness that, you know, you're building or you're, you know, going for the best network of explanations that you can and what seems, you know, evident to you. But there is that kind of threshold. Are you putting this forward as this is the fact, this is what I claim? When that happens, I think it's very important that we make, like, from an orthodox perspective, I think it would be important to allow independent methods of verification to be accessible to people both inside and outside of orthodoxy. So if you want to enter into the philosophical domain and like make declarative propositions about the world, the nature of the world, and that in the sense that you know these things, when you put something like that forward, it should come with like, and this is why. You know, it should be warranted. It should be kind of guaranteed in some sense. If it's like a statement about the world being put into the public sphere, Kurt Doolittle, of course, would really object to someone putting forward things that haven't been properly warranted. And that is actually one thing that I kind of agree with him on, not in as extreme a way as he would have it. Like I am a free speech believer, but as far as like the norms of the discourse and what we should expect from each other, I think it's not good to just be saying, making these bold claims and not having any other justification than it's what the church says, you know, because yeah. So as far as going forward in the discussion, I'd kind of like to go back and get more on this idea of fallen subjectivity. It sounds like an interesting kind of big idea that you have. So why don't we start with like Lacan's notion of subjectivity, and then we can move to Zizek, and then you can, you know, tie it into orthodoxy.
Are you familiar with their writings?
I've read a little bit of Lacan, and I've heard a lot of statements by Zizek. I'm not in depth on either.
Okay. Well, with Lacan, I'm not in depth with Lacan either, and this is a sort of a problem I've had on my channel. Like, I've been like, oh, Hegel said or Lacan said, but it's actually, I got this info from Zizek, and turns out Zizek is not the most accurate. Like, he'll put his own twist to things. So like, I'll have Hegelians be like, what are you talking about? Or Lacanians be like, no, that's not what he said. So I'll just preface this by saying most of my understanding of Lacan comes from Zizek. So the way Zizek understands the subject is basically he sort of finds himself in the psychoanalytical tradition. I think he's connected with Jean-Paul Sartre in a way that he would disagree with. He would disagree with that, but like, so there's an idea in Sartre that the subject is annihilating nothingness, and so what the subject is, it doesn't have any positive content to it. It is just an active withdrawal from the world. So when he says annihilating nothingness, it's just like a pure negativity. So Zizek takes this insight and he understands the subject as what he calls self-relating negativity. So for him, it's sort of just this withdrawal, like basically put, it's a withdrawal from the world. And in this sense, like Zizek will say stuff like intersubjectivity, in the sense of truly recognizing another subject. I quote this all the time. he's like, this is completely impossible. One of his, like, it's not a famous quote, but I want it to be a famous quote. Um, he says, the most radically new thing is not to discover an alien or whatever, but to say, fuck it, another self-consciousness. So like that's a quote by him, because it's like, it's impossible to have this moment when you're like, oh, screw it. There's another actual human being here, because the subject is absolute for him and it's a self-relating entity. So it's impossible for you to sort of jump on your own shoulders, right? And then, for one, perceive yourself objectively, and then two, to have a to experience the other in a in a true sense that sort of moves beyond your own closed circle of subjectivity. So for Zizek, there's two aspects to it. It's self-relating, so closed off from the world, and then part of this is the negativity, the fact that it is an active withdrawal from the world into what Lacan calls the void. So you have an understanding of the subject where the subject is basically this void, this hole in reality. And what really, when I was working, so like I wrote my book is called "A Faces the Impossibility of Subjectivity," and basically I'm working through the Žižekian subject, and then in the final chapter I sort of have a turn to Orthodox theology, trying to show how, like, well, there is a way that we can explain this within an Orthodox understanding of the fall. And like, to me, I think that if we take the principle in Orthodoxy that being or existence is communion, because we're basing this on our understanding of God, the existence, being in its highest form, God himself is the mutual love of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That love contains all that can exist. There's an outflow from the Trinity, a contingent creation, outflow into the nothingness, creating the world. And this world is constituted by, and its being is contingent upon its relation or its communion with God. Only insofar as God is present and we are present in God can there be any being at all. And there's different, and this is why for us the fall isn't a complete break from God, but it's a movement away from God. So there's still, so we'd say there's like partial communion now. And then there's different degrees, like someone who is far more deep into sin would be further out of spiritual communion with God. And then hell would be this absolute abyss of complete withdrawal from God. And when I was reading Zizek and his understanding of the subject, I realized that it fit very well with with an Orthodox understanding of hell, and like the way C.S. Lewis describes hell in The Great Divorce, where it's like it is a self-imposed isolation, this movement away from communion with others and with God, and into this realm of what turns out to be an imaginary realm. Like, it's like what Lacan calls the imaginary. This is where I kind of want to fit it in as well, because it's like when you move away, like, God is objectivity. Communion with him is how you enter back into an objective world. And so, like, C.S. Lewis talks about this as well. Like, our current reality is almost like a dream state, and then when we finally arrive in eternity, it's like we've woken up from the dream. Because literally right now, again, we're understanding being as communion. If we're in a partial form of communion, literally our reality, our present reality, contains less reality than the eternity of God. So I okay, I guess I'll wrap this up and then hear your thoughts on it. But basically, the fallen subject for me, I think Zizek and Lacan provide a description of what the fallen subject is like, and more specifically, what the subject in hell will be like. Like Zizek, one of the most important books for me was I think I have it. Well, maybe I don't. Anyways, it's a book called Hegel in a Wired Brain, and Zizek argues that in the event where we would be put into a wired brain, in the sense that just in the sense that, like, we lose all of our thoughts into like a collective hive mind, so everyone has access to your own inner life and your thoughts. The subject itself, the subject as pure I, whatever you want to call it, this is that one thing, the void behind all of your content, your thoughts and perceptions, that void which is subjectivity, that will remain untouched by the wired brain. And what the wired brain will do is just separate your own internal content from your own pure subjectivity. So you will essentially, in the wired brain, his thesis is the void will be revealed as truly the void, and it'll be a form of like the alienation internal to subjectivity. Like for Lacan, there always is this alienation, a split in the subject. In the wired brain, because the content will be separated from the subject itself, the alienation will be fully visible. And for me, I just think like we just should take Zizek's understanding of the wired brain, like in the void being fully actualized in the wired brain, and I'm basically willing to just say, yeah, let's just swap that out with hell. Like hell is where you're divided from the world, and then so divided from God in the world that this division actually becomes the self division. And I have like parsed this out in videos and writing, and in my writing. But one of the big final thing I'll say, one of the big moments for me was reading a guy named Pavel Florensky, brilliant Russian Orthodox polymath, great philosopher, where he essentially says the exact same thing, like down to like I don't know, I'm sure you've had moments where you're like, whoa, this is crazy. Like I thought of it, or I came to this conclusion, and another guy came to it separately, and it's like, wow, that's pretty crazy. So like that was sort of the moment with me where this big Orthodox theologian basically came to the exact same conclusions as I did just from reading Zizek. So I've gotten more deeper into it, and I'm planning on doing more writing on it. So yeah, in conclusion, yeah, I think the fallen subject and ultimately the subject in hell is essentially described by Lacanian psychoanalysis, and specifically by the Žižekian understanding of the subject as this void of negativity.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure about that starting premise, the kind of negative quality of the subject. My view of subjectivity has always been that it's the unifying principle of all other conscious contents. That's the ego in Carl Jung's definition, that factor which is shared in common among all conscious experiences. And, you know, you're aware of what I've said about that it has to be purely simple because it is the principium individuationis. It's the principle of individuation in the way that we perceive things around us. In the tantric system, this would be, you know, the divine subject would be Purusha, and the divine object would be Prakriti, similar to, you know, Maya, the projected energies of the one singular eternal being. So that the idea that the subject is an essential negation, for me, is not very appealing just because I don't see the explanatory value. The reason I came to the idea that the subject has to be simple, I think you're aware of my argument for, it's what I just said, but then also like it is the distinguishing feature that sets consciousness apart from unconscious systems. You know, like in Leibniz's mill, that thought experiment, you walk in this vast, complex apparatus that it's designed to, it uses Leibniz's calculus or whatever, universal calculus, and comes up with a bunch of propositions or computes propositions or whatever. You go in there and you see how all the pieces connect, but where is the mind? You know, what is it that makes a mind and not just some vast network of interrelated systems? And I think there has to be a unitative quality, and you know that is what subjectivity is like. It's the combination of the one and the many, and I think the one there can only come from a higher unifying principle, because I'm a Platonist, not just because this is what Plato says, but because like anything here that we can characterize in the name of some pattern that we observe, some form, is instantiating a more universal principle, and that more universal principle in having a wider existence in a way has a greater degree of reality, kind of echoing what you were saying before about like this realm being a dream state. Well, Plato says the same thing about this realm, right? The forms have a greater degree of reality than this world. And so unity, you know, qua unity, has a reality prior to my subjectivity, prior to me counting, prior to any countable one or any instantiation of a unity is unity itself. And I think if you combine those two arguments together and say that the core of subjectivity, that which unites everything else into one perception, that thing has to be fundamentally simple, and also it has to derive its nature from a prior unity. Well, then there's no other way for it to go. Then they have to converge on the one singular being, or the thing beyond being, underlying all subjectivity and all unified states. Every unity is a good. Unities qua unities are goods, and therefore emanate from God, which is one and good, the first God, the one in Platonism. Of course, they acknowledge other aspects of divinity, but I mean, even Joseph Campbell, and other perennialists will kind of admit that. People say Hindus are polytheists. Like, yeah, sort of. I mean, they recognize many faces of one fundamental divine nature. Of course, Hindus aren't completely in agreement on that, so I don't want to overgeneralize, but certainly for Advaita Vedanta. So those are the reasons why I posit a unitive quality as like the distinguishing feature of consciousness and subjectivity. Consciousness is kind of the combination of subject and object. And if you go with a pure negation of objective contents, it doesn't explain how the objective contents are integrated together, right? How is it that those things are brought together and maintained in a single unity? I've also thought about it in terms of like fractal structures. Fractals contain in each part the whole of themselves, right? Holographs also have this property, and there's good evidence now in modern physics suggesting that there is a holographic quality to the cosmos as a whole. Of course, that's no surprise for someone who's familiar with the philosophy of Leibniz. That's the whole idea of the monadology. Monads are these kind of holographic units that reflect all other subjectivities, all other aspects of the world, but unified in a particular way. And that's the distinguishing feature. Not the information that each contains, because each contains all, but it contains all in a particular proportionality that defines this monad as opposed to another monad. So that all makes sense to me, and it explains how the many in consciousness is brought into a unity. So any other theory of consciousness, or subjectivity rather, I would kind of require to address that same issue. I want to fix I'm going to close my curtain. It's like crazy light is coming in.
Well, okay.
Okay.
First of all, what I should say is that I do not agree with Žižek anymore that the subject is pure negativity, and like exactly what you said, like it doesn't account for the objective content of consciousness, and even in I recently did re-released my book with the new preface, and like the whole preface is dealing with this specific issue of reading Žižek through orthodoxy, and like you can't, like the void of subjectivity can't account for it's the positive phenomenological content in the same way nothing can't give birth to something. Like it's the exact same principle, and like Žižek has his ways of trying, like for example, this book, incontinence of the void, that like what that means, like what he's trying to get at is that somehow the void, like there's like an incontinence of the void, so like out of the void somehow all of our reality bursts forth. I don't really get, like I sort of get it, like what he's trying to say, I just don't buy it. So like now that I'm Orthodox, like it's not, I don't think it's consistent at all with Orthodox theology to say that the subject is a pure negativity. Like what I'm saying is that pure negativity is a potential of subjectivity that willingly withdraws from God into hell. So I think like an absolute abyss of negativity would be an abyss of hell. It would be the subject that is withdrawn from all communion. So I'm not saying like the subject is negativity. I more so see it as a potential to withdraw away from of withdrawal from God. Now, I'm gonna try my
Well,
best
no,
to be.
let's look at this point. There are three paths
Sure.
I see basically here, three descents into three distinct hells. One would be the lack of integration of objective contents, so as the subject detaches itself and
Hmm.
is not involved, it being the integrating factor, the objective contents are no longer integrated until you get to basically the state of pure matter, the
Yeah.
most basic kind of unity with nothing else. Now, matter in Platonism is alternatively treated as the source of evil or neutral. Proclus treats it
Okay.
as neutral. I think he's correct. Plotinus treats it as kind of the arche of evil. Proclus goes into the arguments why that can't work and doesn't make sense. But ultimately, I think like that state of just like empty whatever is a form of hell, I suppose, or at least it's like the lowest level of spiritual development. You could say
Hmm.
it's arguable whether that kind of entity would even exist in its own hypostasis as a distinct being, because how do you, so say you and I both make poor choices and go down this path, this sort of hell, what is to distinguish then past a certain point my subjectivity from yours? It seems like they have to become isomorphic. So I don't think like just the absence of integration is sufficient to lead to a hell like condition. The another path down is one in which integrating factors within yourself are broken down, but autonomous complexes maintain a degree of unity, such that you have internal conflict, but there is a level of unity maintained. Now, what you get there is more like a kind of primordial chaos, swirling forces, never harmonizing, an absence of unity in a certain respect, but actually a unity that is always underwriting the existence of that chaotic state in the first place. The first
Yeah.
of these hells I'm not as concerned with, and yet it is more so a lack of an integrating factor, seemingly. Maybe we can resolve this, though, by saying that because there is this isomorphism that's reached with the detachment approach, what's really being described is not a hell like condition quite. And so, what we have to look for is not like an indiscriminate voiding of ourselves, but a voiding of particular aspects of ourselves, which leaves a inharmonious combination.
Hmm.
So the
Hmm.
last course to hell that I'm most concerned about is not a backing away of the subject from the contents of the world, but going into the world seeking pleasures to too great an extent. And that, I mean, people can be motivated by erotic sentiments there. They can be motivated in a number of ways to seek unification with objects of desire, what they want to eat, what they want to be around. And
Right.
what happens there is harm of others, and also kind of karmically what you're setting up there with a Kantian imperative in a way is like, okay, I act in a way that is willing or demonstrates a willingness to, kind of harvest the energy of other beings that have their own will.
Yeah.
I'm willing to impinge upon the will of other things in the service of my own will. Well, then, if that's what you're embodying, then it kind of tacitly you are accepting this as a way of things, and this is how beings ought to act. And in that way, kind of like you deserve to exist in a what I would consider a true hell, a realm in which high level parasitical beings exert control over you to suck the positive energy out of you for their own gratification. So I'm more concerned about that, and I don't know how that relates to like the voiding of the subject
Right.
entirely. So what do you think about those three paths, three distinct kinds of hells?
Um, I actually, I'm really glad you brought this up because it's very interesting. So I would say basically what I want to say right away is that I think there's a sort of unity between these three, which is able to be discerned in an Orthodox framework, but maybe not in a Platonist framework. And here's how I'm going to try my best. There's there's a lot of different directions I could go, so I'm just going to stick to one and see where it goes for now. Um, Something you mentioned in a video before is you were talking about Legion, the demon in the Bible that Jesus casts out, and what's really interesting and quite enigmatic about that story is it starts out with one. It starts off with this person is or the demon is speaking in a as a singular person, and then when it's cast out, it becomes Legion, or I'm sort of forgetting the story, but it moves. There's sort of like a disintegration where there's a complete fracturing of Legion. And the point you kind of make is like in your system, if I'm remembering correctly, Satan is less so of an ego, like a person with a concrete center of consciousness, but more so this principle of disintegration. And I guess that sort of fits with your first tell. But so like here's what I will say about this. The Orthodox understanding of like keeping in mind our ontology that being is communion. So to actually have existence is to have this mutual interiority with God and the world, and then non-existence is to not be in this relation of communion with God. So I think there's
That's
two
common to
elements
Platonism as
of
well. I mean,
sure, okay,
nothing, yeah, nothing has existence that doesn't partake of unity in some respect. Unity is like the precondition of existence.
right. And so this is what kind of want to also get at, because like we have to deal with this idea of, because there is a idea of unity in Orthodox theology, but in a way like this is something Jay I think like was talking about or just saying so many times. It's like the unity does not negate the distinctions, and I do agree with that, but I think it has to be cashed out in a specific way. So I'll attempt to do that with my understanding of Legion. And basically, my understanding of the descent to hell consists of two things primarily, which has traditionally been referred to as schism and heresy. Now, I don't understand schism and heresy in just like the sense of like church politics or whatever. Like more specifically, schism for me is the dividing element. So what you would say like the principle of Legion, like dividing from the body of Christ. So schism. And then there is heresy, which heresy isn't just having wrong opinions. Um, like there are saints in our church who had wrong opinions, like what turned out to be heresies, but because it was not a heresy defined as a heresy at the time, they didn't. They're not condemned as heretics. So you're not responsible. At least you have far less responsibility for heretical opinions that you hold if they haven't been defined, because as Jesus says to the Pharisees, if you were blind you would have no sin, but now you say we see, so your sin remains. Like your guilt is largely, if not explicitly, in proportion to your knowledge of the nature of good and evil. So I think what heresy represents is in essence pride. I think it's being told the truth from uh, God ultimately, and then you saying, no, I'm going my way. And that I think is the essence of heresy. So we have pride and then we have uh, division. Now, these seem to be two contradictory things at face value, because in order to be prideful, you need to have an ego. There needs to be some sort of center of consciousness. But and the way I would unify this into a concrete, like I guess dialectically, if you want to put it that way, is that you it is through the affirmation, it is through the prideful affirmation of the ego, which is the withdrawal into self, away from communion, that you get to division. It's because we're understanding being as communion, right? So existence is this mutual interiority, these relations. To withdraw away from these relations is to be move away from the unity of being itself, and to move into a world of division. And this is why the Lacanian notion of the self-divided subject is so important to me, because I see this move to the ego not as we're moving into some either like some nirvana-like state of pure consciousness, or just even just like, oh, I'm just an isolated ego, just like imagining yourself floating in empty space for all eternity. It's more so, it is through this withdrawal that you have a constant disintegration of your own. It's a constant splitting of your own self, because as Saint Maximus the Confessor defines hell, it's a absolute split between your nature, or what you are objectively, and what you are is communion with God, and your will, or your subjective attitude. So that split between your what you objectively are as the image of God, and what you subjectively want to be, or your subjective attitude or state, that split in itself is a split of hell. So the way I would understand this from an orthodox framework, it's not that, like, so as you're saying with the second hell, where it's like, oh, you sort of have, in order to have any experience at all, there would have to be some level of unity, and then there's just like conflict, and you can't fully bring this to a full unity. I would say that there is a paradoxical way of understanding this in orthodoxy, where it's not that there's division on one side and then the affirmation of the ego or yourself as the one, but actually it's through the affirmation, it's through pride. As we say, the primordial sin of Satan is pride. I think ultimately every sin can be reduced to pride. It is through this affirmation of the ego that you get to disintegration. And like, even what you said, like, I think there is some point, there is something to be said about what you were saying with how it's barely, how would you even distinguish between people in this sort of hell? I think there is a very minimal way to distinguish them, but like as C.S. Lewis says, he points out that the sinful path, people, it's like sort of fed to us as like, oh, this is how you express your authentic self, your creative self. But when you actually look at the sins of mankind, people are just reduced to the same. Like, true uniqueness and true creativity is found in the virtuous path, in pursuing the good. And I think like when Jesus, I'm sort of I'm pretty much convinced that when Jesus talks about the fire of hell, what does fire do? Fire consumes things and turns them into ashes. Ashes are essentially indistinguishable from each other. So I think that there is a sense in which, when you're reduced to this pure void, when you lose all your empirical content, there is very little aside from your own just selfhood which distinguishes you from others. So there is something to that idea. So uh, now the third hell, what I'll say is, I think that the third hell is more so the path towards this full disintegration, which of course comes in the form of the affirmation of the ego, the prideful affirmation. And I think Heidegger provides like in Being and Time, when he talks about Dasein losing itself to the world in its everydayness, like it forgets its own authentic self. I see a complete homology here between Heidegger's understanding of losing yourself to das Man, or the they, and the public world, whatever you want to call it, and the Orthodox view of losing yourself to the passions. So I think that it's through the passions that the subject, as a center of consciousness, loses control of its inner contents, because you are literally losing your empirical self to the world, and to passions, and this opens up the space for demonic influence, and even demonic possession. Um, um, and it is from my knowledge of demonic possession, like actual demonic possession that has occurred, typically the person themselves in their subjectivity do remain, like when they are like in the case of, like, I do believe in like actual exorcisms. Like, I think when demons are cast out of people, there are people are like, oh, it wasn't just purely I have no experience at all. I was in like this dark chamber, or whatever you want to call it, where like I was preserved in my subjectivity, and then it was my empirical being that was taken over by the devil. So the way I would see, I guess, just to summarize, I see disintegration and the schism aspect and the heresy or pride aspect are two sides of the same token, because if we're understanding being as communion, then it's through the affirmation of the ego that we get disintegration. And I would say that the third hell, where it's like opening yourself up to demonic possession, this is sort of the path into this. Because ultimately, I am an optimist, and I do believe in the eschaton, whatever you want to call it. I do think there will come a time when the demons will lose their influence over people. So, but like, I do think there will come a time when there will no longer be these relations of domination between people and between demons, because God will be all in all. But insofar as you have your own subjectivity is turned away from God, and you will be cast alongside the devil into the fire, into the lake of fire, which I just interpret as the presence of God, which is experienced as this. I'm sure you're familiar with common Orthodox view that hell is the lake of fire is the light of God.
Is the what?
Is the light of God, the energies of God.
Okay.
The lake of, like, for us, like Saint Augustine believed in, like in the Western Church believed in like a literal material fire that God created. Like, this is at least my interpretation of Augustine. And then the damned that are resurrected are thrown into this material lake of fire. But for us, the lake of fire is just symbolic of the divine energies or the Holy Spirit. It's the presence of God, which, because of your subjective state, your disposition, the presence of God, by the very nature of the case, is experienced as pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't see any of that that's inconsistent with Platonism. So I'm not sure why you think that this account, explains something else. I would say that the pride and heresy aspect as a root of sin. Do you think that all sin stems from pride? Because I'm trying to think of other cases. I think more general than pride would be I guess selfishness, right? Because there are people who don't have. I think pride is a self-reflective emotion. And there are non-self-reflective states of sin. I would consider some animals to be more sinful than others, but I wouldn't necessarily characterize. Could you stay a little bit more in the middle of the frame? I've cropped out some. Okay, thank you. So I wouldn't necessarily characterize an animal as prideful. They can have like a haughty nature, but pride seems like a distinct thing.
Well, I don't think we'd say that. I don't think we'd say that animals can sin, like from an orthodox perspective, because sin is contingent upon your consciousness, your knowledge of good and evil. Like, that is a precondition of sin for us.
Right, and I don't think it's dependent on propositional knowing. I think propositional knowledge is a higher form of knowing. But I do notice qualitative differences between animals, and some animals have a very gentle and harmonious temperament, and like they'll even get along better with the other animals. I have a lot of animals, and some of them make more mistakes. I think the nature of sin as like a deviation from true wisdom, or deviation from like going after the good, would be a lot more general than propositional knowing. Also, I think that's tied to this like heresy, pride idea. It just seems like it's confining things to the human level, human ways of thinking, and saying this is the root of evil. But I think the root of evil is in a way deeper. Also, I wouldn't admit there is a single root of evil. I think there is, rather than a principle of disintegration, a single one. There are disintegrating types to correspond to every generative type. So for a particular nature, there is its sin that violates its intrinsic nature. I wouldn't, because there are different ways that things are subject to corruption. Human beings are subject to corruption in ways that animals are not, and so there are unique evils of human nature. But that's something I've never really appreciated in Orthodox or many Protestant Christian perspectives, and Catholics just never really talk about it. But just kind of the state of animals spiritually. Like, it seems like many Christians are okay with factory farming and conditions that lead to a lot of cruelty, if you suppose that animals do have subjectivity, and I think it's kind of ridiculous to think they don't. Also, I wonder metaphysically, how your notions of subjectivity would apply to animals if you grant them subjectivity. And if you don't grant them subjectivity, I think it's like leads to weird moral calculuses where like you shouldn't be concerned about you know, the welfare of your animals. Any like generosity or kindness you display to them is only to like cultivate your own virtues, but then that's kind of a selfish mentality. I think, I don't know, when I interact with animals, they show a lot of signs of consciousness. Also, like why are they able to act in the world if they don't have that consciousness? So I think it's clear that animals can make mistakes as far as like getting along with others. They can be more loving, they can be less loving. If love is unity and God is unity, they can be more or less in accordance with God, therefore. So they can sin and be good. And if depriving animals of that, I think does, like, it lessens their status, obviously, and I think would encourage more cruelty, and I think historically it has. Also, there's something that's just missing as far as an explanation of breeding of animals and why farmers take such care to select for gentle temperaments if there is no such thing as sin and virtue in animals. I think animals definitely do have virtues and vices. So, and if you want to make sin like an exclusively human property, then of course, I do think there are uniquely human sins and ways that humans fail. So those are some of the points I would have. And obviously I object to the claim that heresy is motivated by pride. I mean, you've already admitted you don't know about a lot of scientific fields, and yet you subscribe to these views because it's what the church says. Is that an unprideful act, purporting to have an opinion on things that you do not know, that you acknowledge you do not know, and yet because of this institution? Also, the church I would accuse of pride. I would accuse the leaders of the church of pride, of many churches of pride. I think pride is a human universal to some extent, and if that's the root of sin, then I think the least prideful people out there are not, famous Orthodox theologians. They are like monks in meditation somewhere in India. I think, yeah, if pride is the root of sin, then the absence of pride should be, the perfection of the human condition. And I don't see how that is dependent on the doctrines of the Orthodox Church. So yeah, I do object to that. It presumes too much, and I think that the pride charge can be turned against Orthodox people, especially when they make claims to knowledge and then can't substantiate it. I've been online for 10 years saying my opinions, stating them as opinions, not like dogmatic facts that must be accepted and you're going to hell if you disagree. I've been, engaging philosophically with the public, and only a handful of Orthodox Christians have reached out to me or tried to, make contact. And I think if they have an obligation to evangelize, they should have. More Christians should be reaching out to me, and I see that as evidence of pride on the part of Christians who are insulted and afraid of my views, which are not dogmatically espoused by myself, but are put forward as philosophical hypotheses with justifications at any step you want to hear, rather than a blank check, I am right in all these respects because X institution says so. I think all human institutions are fallible, and it is a pride of group identity to say, my team is right. And that is a serious epistemological failing. Also, I think if you look at the history of the Orthodox Church, it's just very clear that they took their theology from the philosophy of Platonism. And you can, explain that in ways saying like Plato was a kind of non-Hebrew pre-Christian prophet in a certain respect. I've seen people take this tact, but like the more kind of mundane, obvious explanation is the people controlling institutions of higher education in the classical world, the late antiquity, were Neoplatonists. And when the church forcibly suppressed and censored pagan philosophy and Neoplatonic schools of thought, the people who were afraid of being killed, like Hypatia, the people who didn't want to be murdered by Christians, just went ahead and went along with the program and then continued their Neoplatonic philosophy within the confines of the church. I think it's very clear that Pseudo-Dionysius did take material from Proclus and not vice versa. There's no evidence that there was a first century figure. I mean, there is in the book of Acts, Dionysius the Areopagite. He was a real person, probably. I mean, I have no reason to doubt that. But yeah, I object to this this notion of pride tied to rejecting or accepting the doctrines of the church. It's a huge question bag in any engagement with anyone of another view. And Orthodox people do it, and I really do. It is not something that I approve of, and I think it's not something that cultivates people's growth. It can be effective rhetorically just to double down and say, my favorite source is omniscient. My favorite source of information knows everything about everything, explains the world. No, I can't explain it all, but it's just like a weird, this is my daddy figure, my big brother figure who knows everything, and I think it stifles discourse. So yeah, I think I've made my objection to that clear. Also, I don't see how that is an improvement on your explanation there of evil is improving on Platonism in any respect.
Well, okay. Well, firstly, I'll just I'll just say that when I related heresy to pride, like that wasn't meant to be like a shot at you or anything. Like I'm not that's not really.
But are you maintaining that or not? Are you maintaining it or not? Because this is what I'm saying. The intersection of like your worldview, your church views, and then philosophy and philosophical discourse. How do you treat an interlocutor if, according to what you believe, I am committing a grievous sin by not agreeing with you?
Okay. Well, I think it really, like, I'm not saying I know, like, the last thing I want to say is I know your heart or anyone's heart in their internal dispositions. It just seems like when I compared it to heresy, my point was really that the way I've read the traditional way the Orthodox Church has understood what heresy is and how heresy works. Like if you read Augustine, and I know you have problems with the view that Augustine was this extremely humble guy as well, but like I'm taking him sort of as a saint with opinions that should be regarded, like taken into account of. When he speaks of the Donatists, when he speaks about what keeps them away from salvation, it's not some magical power of the canonical church, because he even says like there's sacraments outside, like in the Donatists have their sacraments, they're baptized Christians. The one thing he says that they do not have is charity. So you can dispute this, but like, what I'm not trying to make a historical claim. I'm trying to make a claim in terms of sort of like principles here, that when I say heresy, what I mean is when you are confronted with objective truth, and like again, is there a sort of pridefulness? Like we wouldn't say it's prideful. I guess the tradition, like our term would be a boldness. Like we believe in the revelation of Christ through the church. I know you have your disagreements, but like that is sort of my presupposition. And the way we understand heresy is a doubling down in your own opinion in response to essentially the truth. And like when I and I don't think like, and I see this as a function of the body as a whole. So like when the body as a whole makes a decision on a particular person in a particular viewpoint, if that person continues to persist in that view, they are objectively a heretic by our definition. Now, I know, like, I know your disagreements with this and and stuff like that. Uh, but like in general, I think really the essence of pride is seeing truth and like seeing truth and seeing that you did not have truth, and then turning inwards and accepting your and going your own path as opposed to the path of truth. Like that's how I understand pride. So I, in the barest sense, I think pride is choosing yourself over God.
Yeah,
Now,
I think it would be
whether that,
irrational to try to go completely by yourself, which is why I don't. I go for the history of Western philosophy in its entirety and Eastern philosophy and whatever other wisdom I can garner. And I trust men who display evident virtue like humility, like altruism. And I trust in scientific communities, and I trust in like good faith public discourse to constantly test myself. I think going it by yourself and trying to be this autodidactic, self-made philosopher is a bad idea. I also think picking a team and saying my team is always right, definitionally, I'm not supposed to doubt that even. I think that is prideful. And I think in any other context, it would be seen as pride. I think it has a lot of explanatory gaps, that just orthodoxy in general. So I accept evolutionary psychology, and it makes sense why people would have pride in identity groups that they associate with. It's a kind of, extended sense of ego, has evolutionary advantages. So when I see the way that Orthodox regard others and the kind of haughty attitude that they often do display, people like Jay Dyer talking over people and acting like their other opinions don't matter, I see huge pride in that. You can call it boldness, but it doesn't look like civil discourse. And the ancient discourse did not look civil. And I don't see what, like, classic problems like the eternity of the world versus the creation of the world were never argued for in depth and settled by Christians. Christians persecuted and executed those who disagreed.
Well, I mean, firstly, in terms of like the online behavior stuff, like I'm not someone who would defend that in any way, really. I think there is a huge problem, quite an ironic problem as well, with the ortho bro community, with pride and just this weird debate style, which is simultaneously uncharitable and unproductive. So yeah, yeah, I'm not a fan of that. But like, um, I think that essentially we kind of have a disagreement here that I don't know can be resolved, because like for me, I'm not like an extreme like rigorist where I don't see the grace of God outside of the Orthodox Church. I think that the Orthodox Church is the best way and the normative way to achieving union with God, and I and to me, like the historical reality of how it played out, like I would certainly disagree with your take on certain church fathers, I'm sure, and like whether or not they were engaging in prideful behavior, and whether like even whether uh the establishment of dogma is like an expression of pride. Like I don't agree with that, obviously, but like I think we sort of have a disagreement here that I think it's sort of at a presuppositional level more than
You have
something we can really
presuppositions
debate.
that I won't accept, and you can't argue for your presuppositions. And you've said you can't argue for them. And so, like, we're trying to
Like
have a
what? Like
philosophical
what
discussion
presuppositions?
when you will not engage philosophically on certain things. And that's
But
a
what
paradox, and that seems to
presuppositions in
be
this case?
what's that? Your
What
presuppositions that
presuppositions in this
all the
case?
doctrines of the church, all the dogmas of the orthodoxy are true, and it's heresy to go against them. That is presupposed because you haven't argued for all of them. You're presupposing most of them, except for the one you
Well,
have argued for some in certain respects, and most of those are derived from Platonism.
I don't think I can provide a philosophical defense for all. Like, I don't think I'm personally capable of doing so. I do believe, and I trust from my experience with Orthodoxy that it can be done. Like, and I know there are theologians in the church, which, I mean, I need to read, which have provided these sort of philosophical defenses for like the ruling at the Council of Chalcedon. Like all of this stuff, I do think does have a defense. Like I sort
But
of
you're
just, like,
presupposing it. You're presupposing
currently,
it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm presupposing it's true, but like I'm not I don't think I'm relying too much on the presuppositions in our particular debate. Like, it's like, I should clarify again, like when I was talking about heresy and schism, like for me, heresy, I wasn't saying that all of the heretics, all everyone who disagrees with the Orthodox Church is motivated by pride. No, I don't believe that, but I do believe those who were the essence of heresy, like when it comes down to it, that's what I think it is.
Well, then this doesn't make sense, because you're saying that all non-Orthodox people are heretics, and the essence of heresy is pride. Therefore, all non-Orthodox are what they are because of pride. It's the essence of heresy. You said.
I make a distinction between formal and material heretic. I wouldn't want to call someone a heretic who is like disagrees and honestly isn't familiar, and like both spiritually and just in terms of their not, like they haven't had the experience of the Holy Spirit. And then like, because I do believe from personal experience and from testimony that where there are moments where the Spirit will sort of press the question about Christ, about God, about changing the ways in your life. And I do think there are very clear moments in people's lives where they can choose to follow the good or choose to further in the path of destruction. And I think that really that is really the essence of pride. It's like this movement towards self-destruction, which is ultimately your own path as opposed to God's path. So like I don't think everyone is like, I would say they're heretics in the sense that like they believe in heresies, but I don't think they've made that formal spiritual disposition, which is full embrace of heresy. And I do think, like, I will admit that I think this idea is more implicit in the earlier church than now, but I think there are modern Orthodox theologians. C.S. Lewis, he's not Orthodox, but he's also talked about this, like the necessity of this knowledge of, like, and I think it's very clear in the Bible, like Paul says he was forgiven for persecuting the church, and the reason he was forgiven is because he did so in ignorance. So I think there is a very, very almost one-to-one connection between knowledge of good and evil and committing good and evil in the moral sense. And so when I say heresy, it may have even been a poor term, but like ultimately when it gets down to it, what my point was trying to be is that I don't think there is a conflict between the different ideas of hell, which I think by having like the three different hells, I sort of saw you making a distinction between there, where you have like on one side you have the subject sort of remains, but there's the disorder, so like the second hell, but then there's pure disintegration. But I would just say that type of the pure disintegration, so far as that is possible, comes through the affirmation of the ego, because ultimately this ends up being a self-division, because it's a division between nature and will, or your objective state and your subjective state. So that's really all I was saying. Like we could continue on this point, but I don't
So leaving the points about orthodoxy aside, and I don't know, so I say leave it aside for 1 second. I don't know that like the prophets in the Old Testament had the kind of mentality that you're talking about, where they, if they were inspired by the Spirit themselves without the evidence of the tradition, they would still speak what they believed God was telling them. And that's how I see philosophy. I think that's how many philosophers see it. It is this pursuit of the truth led by something beyond themselves. If you want, Orthodox people often want to be taken on their own terms in a way, and I think you should take philosophers on their own terms, in their own way, and not assume that it is out of pride that they're trying to find the truth it just seems very bizarre to me. But anyway, this point about disintegration, the first hell, the reason I drew this trichotomy was to try to like distinguish between a separation of subject and object, or a like cessation of the integrating function of the ego with a hellish condition. And I was trying to point to that for evil to exist, and this is a Procline point, there has to be some distortion of an existing good. So either a pure chaotic state where there are many integrated factors at war with one another inside yourself, or a state where there is good being produced and a higher being, I don't mean higher, I mean like more powerful evil being is manipulating affairs for its benefit. So a parasitical hierarchy and a chaotic state both meet like a hellish requirement for me. Whereas if I go to like a cessation of the integrating factors of the natural world, of the world of perception, that looks very much like a return to the one in a certain respect. And so I think what that points to is that there is both a like virtuous and vicious mode of detachment, that not all detachment will necessarily be evil, and that depends on your cosmological assumptions and the assumptions you have about the relation that you have to things in the world. If you're with Leibniz, right, that you already contain the logoi of the world in your own soul, that you are not separate from things, fundamentally, if you go inside yourself and stop like modeling your environment, you may well be returning to a greater kind of integrating factor that is not of your own doing as your own egoic self. So your ego that like forms the perception of the world around you may stop what it's doing, and yet it leads to a higher kind of unity. This is the paradox that I mentioned before. Like, what is the distinguishing principle between you and I if we both pursue that path of like absolute detachment? It becomes isomorphic. And so I think that is not a true hell. So I was just trying to distinguish like detachment from what is actually evil, which is there is no one nature of evil. In my opinion, there are many. This is why, Satan is legion, whatever. There are many distorting forces in opposition to many good natures. So for each particular good, there is an evil. That's why like evil is a sub-contrary of the good, according to Proclus, and not a contrary. It's not like good versus evil. Evil is the opposite. That leads to a Manichaean kind of dualism, I think, necessarily. So instead, evil it's a particular corruption of particular natures. And so that's one level of evil. There, I wonder, how that applies to the first case of like no longer integrating the factors of your environment. Is that the corruption of that being necessarily, or is that like ascending to a higher integrating factor that is beyond your local ego into these kind of mystic states that people talk about, that even, Catholic mystics like Eckhart or Thomas Aquinas himself experienced. And yeah, the Desert Fathers, like people describe these sorts of mystic states even within Christianity, and it often is described as like, you're no longer kind of in the world. There is a concept of transcendence that maybe isn't a corruption. So I wanted to make that distinction. But also the point, so there's evil as a corruption, evil as a parasitism, and then evil as like conflicting forces within oneself. And I wouldn't treat them homonymously. I would treat them, am I using the wrong term there? No, I would treat them homonymously, not synonymously. So equivocally, not unequivocally. I don't know that there can be a single theory of all evil, because I don't know that evil is one kind of oppositional force to the good. So just to bring it back to that kind of philosophical point, and that was the main meat of what we discussed. It does bother me, the whole accusation levied against me by Orthodox and many different types of Christians online. People will say, I'm a heretic or whatever because I don't conform to your school of thought. There are many schools of thought out there. I am pursuing the truth, and I am doing it with the Spirit of God, as far as I can tell. And to have that kind of undermined and say, people telling me the source of your disagreement with me is pride, I'm going to shoot back exactly that at you, and I don't know that you have, you know, a way of demonstrating that your presupposition, which you admit to be a presupposition, is right. I don't know that you should have the pride to assume it. I do think that takes pride. And so I think we should probably wrap up now. I'm about to start a reading group in about 5 minutes, so I'll give you the last word, whatever you want to say.
Okay. Well, I guess the last thing, I think we should have another discussion, maybe on my channel. I think really the big issue, aside from the stuff on trusting, the church ultimately, and like whether that's philosophically justified and all that stuff, and our different presuppositions and ways of doing philosophy and this sort of stuff. I think the ultimate issue, really, like philosophically, our difference has to do with our understanding of the one and the many, because we didn't even get to it, and that's why I think we should have another discussion. Like I do think there is a way to understand subjectivity without falling in, or without having to accept some form of monism. And I think it's provided by Trinitarian ontology and a Trinitarian understanding of subjectivity. And like ultimately, like even what you were saying with evil, like for me, it's not there's multiple paths to evil and then one path to the good. I would take actually the complete opposite I would say the complete opposite thing. I think there's one path to evil. It's withdrawal into yourself, and ultimately, when everything is reduced down to it, and then there's and then there's multiple infinite paths towards God because of the infinite energies, the infinity of God. There's multiple paths towards God, which is ultimately ends in the same destination by your own unique way, so that you preserve your own unique subjectivity without being reduced to a higher subjectivity in a monistic sense, which you were talking about with your understanding of subjectivity. But yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. I think we should have another conversation. I did enjoy this one. You did ask some questions that I admit I have not encountered directly from people before, which I'll have to think about. But thanks for having me on, Eric.
Sure, Trey. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too.